a study of the book of 1 John called Illuminate. It's a book that John is really straightforward in his vocabulary. So if you've been following along, and I hope you will, if you go to our website and you hit the current sermon series, there is a download of devotionals that you'll find for every day of the week. Our pastors from all the campuses, they all participated. So over these 10 weeks, they have helped to write 10 weeks of devotions. And I hope that you're taking advantage of that. Gives you a little glimpse into their heart as well. And they are here for the best of reasons, to see people really grow in their walk with Jesus. All of this is the way John is providing us with some truths about the path that should lead us forward. And so we're able to do that together as a congregation as we're walking through these chapters. I had a very cool experience this past week. On Friday, I had to get up early, and so I was out at Kittery Point near Forsyth. If you guys know where that is, it's a little restaurant road down there, and they have this awesome little coffee shop there called Lil's. They have French crullers that are like drugs. Seriously, you have one and it's like a temptation to eat a dozen. And you fool yourself like, oh, they're really nice and airy in the middle. Yeah, trust me. So I went in there and I bought myself a cruller and a cup of coffee, and I went outside and I sat, and it was another beautiful day like today. And I sat right next to the glass window for the shop. And so I was, just going over my outline and everything for this weekend. And all of a sudden I got this little tap on the window, and I looked over, and there was this little kid. He was about maybe 4 or 5 years old. And he's like waving at me, like little kids do. And so I gave him a little thumbs up, and he kind of gave me this big thumbs up, put his hand on the window. I put my hand on the window. And this happened for about, couple of minutes and just having fun. And then his mother called him and said, probably said, stop bothering the guy. And so she got her thing. And so I'm back working, and all of a sudden I get this little tug, and I look over, and he and his mom had come out from the store, and he started talking to me like we were family, And he's like, hey, I'm on my way to school. And I'm like, well, that's awesome. And I said, what school did you go to? And so we're having this conversation, and he says, and I just got a haircut. And I'm like, yo, you're looking pretty handsome. So I said, what's your name? He said, my name is Wild Errol. How's that for a name? Seriously, he's going to be a movie star, I think. His name is Wild. So I looked at the mother. I said, does he live up to his name? And so we're having this thing, and all of a sudden I'm just starting to chat with the mom a little bit, and this little boy just walks up and gives me this biggest bear hug. Exactly. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, yeah, that was awesome. So I just hug him, and and then we go back, and then she says, okay, we got to go. You're going to be late for school. So he starts to walk away, gets about 5 steps, turns around, runs back, and gives me another big hug. And I'm like, that was totally unprovoked, innocent. It was like we were family. And I just thought that hug was better than the sunshine. And as the little kid walked away, I just had this stupid grin on my face, like he thought somebody paid for my lunch or something. And then I said, well, let me get back to work. And my eyes came down on the text for this morning. And it was in 1 John 3:11. And it says, this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. And as I sat there, I just got really quiet for a moment, because I just had this experience of what that love felt like from this little kid. And it made me think of another experience that I had on Wednesday. See, because on Wednesday I went to speak at Recovery Church. Freddie and Joy lead up this ministry. You've seen the van outside. I got bridged. They had over 100 people who are doing battle against life's addictions. And they came in, and they have dinner. They go, I happen to be there on the award ceremony, people getting, little coins for how many months, years that they have been sober. And it was really touching to be a part of this whole group. And in the midst of that, a gentleman who's here today, his name is Derek. Derek comes up to me and says, hey, you got a minute? And so we just sat down and started having this conversation. And I asked Derek, I said, hey, Derek, give me a little bit of an understanding of what goes on behind that face of yours. Just tell me a little bit about your life. And he began to unfold for me, a real trying childhood. Father was a musician, right? Rock and roll player, and all of the downside that sometimes can come with that. The drugs and the traveling, and it wasn't a really stable environment for either him or his sister, and he then shared with me one of the saddest days in his life was losing his best friend, his sister, who was overcome with her addictions. And then all of a sudden, you get this twinkle in Derek's eye, and he's like, but life is good now, man. Jesus is my life. He showed me pictures of this job. He works as a landscaper and does excellent work. And he's like, I'm living in a great place now. I'm in a good place now. And then it was getting time for me to get up there and do my thing. And he comes over and he just gives me this big hug. Unprovoked, kind of innocent, just like we were family. And as he walked away, I just had this big smile on my face again. See, it just seems like on both ends, right? Like I had an experience of what this verse is all about. When we come to worship God, that's the message that we ought to be leaving here with. This isn't about rules and regulations. It's not about God being this heavy and, pointing the finger. No. God does point a finger, but he's pointing it upward, just saying, hey, look at me. I am able to do exceeding abundant in your life. I can give you my power and exchange it for your weakness. I think that's a great gift. And so when you begin to read this text, you begin to realize that this is exactly what the Apostle John is all about. And it's all about this love. It's about God's greatest gift that he is given to us. No wonder he doesn't want us to forget it. That's why he says, listen, this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. But let me give you another little key to understanding this book. Because up to this point, it seems like John has been giving a lot of emphasis on right living. By right living, he's talking about people who are listening to the commands of God, right? His direction, and seeking to incorporate that into their life. Because right living is living that reflects God's will and God's purposes. It's not just about doing good, but the doing good that God is calling us to is what is reflective of his will and his purposes. And so as a person lives this way, it says that person now is righteous. And so throughout the first half of this book, in fact, it starts this way, doesn't it? If you go back to chapter 1 and verse 5, in chapter 1 and verse 5, it says this. It says, this is the message that you have heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is what? Is light. And in him, there is no darkness at all. That's why if you remember, if you've been part of this study, we go back and it says, if you say that you are in the light, then how could you be walking in darkness? The two are incompatible. If I say that I know him and he is light, then my life ought to be reflective of that light. Otherwise, all I'm doing is praising God with my lips, and my life is in a completely different direction. We have a word for that in English, right? a hypocrite. You're saying one thing, but your life is speaking volumes in another direction. But now we come to this text, and it's saying that the call isn't just that God is light, but you're going to see that God is love. So right living, making sure that I am reflecting God's will and purposes. Now he's saying, let's see if you really got that lesson, because here's the application of that. And if you say that you love God, but you hate your brother, then the love of God is not in you. I love these passages because it just like cuts through all this nicey talk and just says, listen, if you love me, then love your brother. But I don't like my brother. I realize that. But what you don't know is if you love him, you might be giving him a chance to become a different person. People invested that way in my life. I was pretty self-centered, all my agenda. And they started talking to me about Jesus, and the more I looked at my life in comparison to his, I'm thinking, yeah, this doesn't seem like it's running parallel. So what I want to share with you this morning is this whole perspective now that John is going to bring to the table about God is love. And he starts off by giving you a poor example of it. Because if you read in verse 12, he goes on and says, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. This is a reference to Genesis chapter 4. I do a program called Seize the Day, and this is one of those instances now where this coming week I'm going to take that passage, Genesis 4, and I'm going to help unfold it for you because there's some really good lessons in there. But for the purpose of the sermon, I just want to stick with what John is doing, and John is making a reference to Genesis chapter 4 when he mentions Cain. You know the story, right? Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve, they have children. Cain's the firstborn. He tends the fields, and then they have another son named Abel, and Abel tends the flocks. Comes time for them to present an offering to God. God shows favor to one and not the other. Happened to be Cain. Cain doesn't like it. He gets mad. God gives him a warning, but not before the warning. He also shows him grace. He says, hey, why are you so unhappy? Why is your face so downcast? Don't you know that if you do what's right, that you'll receive the same response that your brother Abel had? In other words, come on, let's just get with the program, that's all. And he says, but let me tell you that sin is crouching at the door. It wants to devour you. But you need to master it. So God has not only given Cain grace, and they're saying, listen, one mistake doesn't make you out of the game. Come on, let's get with the program. But what it did was God was also telling him, like, this is going to be the challenge in your life. Who are you going to listen to? You make those wrong choices, and after a while, those choices begin to build up, and the next thing you know, your life is in a different path, and then one day you're going to look at that and you're going to go, how did I get here? Well, you didn't get there in one giant leap. You usually got there by making a bunch of choices that little by little brought you into another direction. And so here, John is saying, after he says, listen, we ought to love one another, he gives them an example of what that did not look like. Because he goes on in the same passage, and he says this. He mentions the fact that there was this antagonism, and then he adds. He says, "Don't be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil, and his brothers were righteous." So however you look at that Old Testament story, here you're given an interpretive key in how to understand the story of Cain and Abel. You need to walk away from reading that story recognizing that Cain's actions were evil and the brothers were righteous. What is righteous? Righteous is exactly what John has been telling us in this book. Righteous living isn't just doing good, but righteous living is doing God's good. Let me just say this one time, because this is a really important part, because we live in a culture where people just think, hey, you should just be good to people. But have you ever done good and then realized that you actually hurt people? Your intentions may have been right, but the end result of that could be that you actually hurt people. You keep them in a position of dependency, maybe. There's a book, it's a great book. It's called When Helping Hurts. Right? And so what we're being told in this book is that Abel, he honored God, and God then honored him, but not so much with Cain. And so Cain needed to go back and reevaluate his decision making and bring it back more into conformity with God's will. And God was more than willing to give him another opportunity, and even warned him about what could be the result of that. And so you look at this, and God now provides the counsel for him. At the end of the day, Adam's actions, what they did was they revealed Cain's deficiency. You catch that? Like when Abel did the right thing, even though he wasn't doing it just to show up his brother, because if that was the case, I think God would have turned around and said, yo, Abel, stop being such a suck up. Right? I don't need your offering, Abel. I want your heart. Because now you're just playing the game. You just want to look better than Cain. But that's not what happened. What happens is that Abel offered his offering to the Lord, and God received it and praised him. But he refused Cain's offering and said, come on, dude, you could do better. And so what Adam did, his gift, it just showed that Cain was deficient. Listen to this, Adam's light exposed Cain's darkness. You catch that? Adam's light, the things that he did right, what it did was it revealed Cain's darkness, that Cain wasn't doing it right. Isn't that what Jesus did? How many times would Jesus engage the Pharisees, who were noted for their understanding of Scripture, right? They knew the laws, and they were the spiritual leaders for some. And yet Jesus would often rebuke them. He says, because you're saying one thing, but you're doing another. You talk all about this law, and then you make it hard for people. And then they would take issue with Jesus over the minutest little things like eating without washing their hands. Because to them, they had this rule, you don't eat without washing your hands as a sign that, I am, washing sin out of my life here. Here's a symbol, right? And Jesus says, you're going to get more upset with people who didn't wash their hands than with the understanding that you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. So in the end, it's about your rule. It's not really about mine. And how did they react to Jesus when he would do that? They wanted to take him out. And eventually they did. And so that's why after this example of Cain, as a poor example, John goes on and then just gives us a little bit more insight, because then he says, don't be surprised, my brothers, if the world hates you. Well, how did we get from talking about Cain to now talking about the world? Because the idea of raising Cain was to show that God approved of Abel, disapproved of Cain, and now look what happened. Cain kills his brother. And why did he kill his brother? Why did he murder his brother? If anything, he could have just been angry with God for the rest of his life. Just hold it against him. People do that, right? Things happen in one's life and then we blame God. There's 1,001 ways we could do that. And now we just put ourselves in a position where any kind of reconciliation, any kind of peace, any kind of the fruit of God's Spirit that he wants to be evident in our life, we just put out of hand's reach. So Cain's really mad at God, but he takes it out on his brother. And why did he take it out on his brother? Because his brother made him look bad. So he can't do anything about God, but I'm going to show my anger against him, and he kills his brother. And what Jesus, what John is now saying to you and me, he says that's the way it happens in the world too. I don't have to tell you that, right? Because as you pay attention to John's reasoning, many who have a worldly perspective, are saying, look at my truth in opposition to God's truth. When you have that attitude, we're often going to take issue with those who are doing the righteous thing. You know what that looks like, right? When you don't participate in the ways of some friends or, people co-workers, if you don't get on the bandwagon to wave the flag that they want you to wave or say the words that they want you to say, all of a sudden now you're what? You're labeled. And if we're not careful, we react in a way that just is repaying evil with evil, and that's not good. God's saying to you and me as believers, we have to return good for evil. So I wrote down a couple of things here. It says, how often have you heard these kinds of expressions? When you don't go along with the program and people say, oh, you think you're better than me? You've heard that. Do you think Abel was doing that? Abel was bringing his offering to God in a way that God received. I don't think that Abel then turned around and looked at his brother saying, see how good I am? Because that would have nullified what he just did. But he was all about pleasing God. And that light cast that light on on Cain's darkness, and he didn't like it. And sometimes that's how you are. You're going out there, you're just trying to do what God has called us to do, be that light of the world, be the salt of the earth, and you get back, oh, you think you're better than me? Or how about, you're not a very loving person, you're very judgmental. So because I'm trying to do what God is saying, that makes me judgmental, because I'm not agreeing with what you're doing. Or how about this one? You have no right to tell me how to live. I want you to think about that. You have no right to tell me how to live. Aren't they telling you how to live? When you say you have no right to tell me how to live, you're telling them that they don't have a right. So the thing that they're accusing you of, they're doing themselves. But I digress. How about this one? Are you trying to make me look bad? Actually, I think you're doing a pretty good job by yourself. You don't need my help. That's my inside voice. I don't really say that out loud, unless I'm preaching. But you get the point, right? Sometimes when you let your light shine, it's going to spotlight what is not good. And those who live in darkness, they don't like it. And in the case of Cain and Abel, you saw the result. But then notice what he says in verses 14 and 15. He says, we know that we have passed from death to life because we love our brothers. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life in him. As you're reading those verses, that's a pretty severe inference, isn't it? But Jesus gave us some words in the Sermon on the Mount that I think are going to prove to be a little helpful in this situation. Because Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, of which John the Apostle, right, grew up under Jesus' teaching here, right? And now he's out there just reflecting what Jesus taught him. Well, what did Jesus teach? Well, let's go back down to Matthew chapter 5, because this is a great text where all of this language comes together. Jesus says, you have heard that it's been said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. See, Jesus is referring to the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. If we're not careful, you read that verse and people can interpret it. They'll say, well, thou shalt not murder. Well, I haven't taken anybody's life. I haven't killed anybody. So I could check that box off because now I'm a good person. But listen to what Jesus goes on to say, because Jesus takes it to a whole nother level. He goes on, he says, but I tell you this, that whoever is angry with his brother will be subject to the judgment. So the judgment that falls on those who commit murder, the complete absence of understanding this sanctity of life here, God's saying, no, those who murder, they're gonna be judged. If in your anger you demonstrate that towards your brother, you're in trouble. How often have you heard that expression, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me? You do know that's untrue, right? Right now, those of you in Raymond, in Kittery, even here now in Greenland, if I was to ask you just this question, right? Like, what's some of just think back on a hurtful thing that somebody said to you that still you hold on to. In the nanosecond it took me to say that, your mind has already gone to a situation in your life where somebody said something unkind to you. It could have been way back when you were a kid, and somebody took this nail and they just drive it into your heart, and you have a hard time getting rid of it. Sometimes if you hear those messages over and over and over again, what does it do to your spirit? How easy is it for people to grow in that kind of environment? Having that conversation with Derek made it perfectly clear to me again the consequences of growing up in an environment where instead of building you up, they're tearing you down. And you kind of grow up thinking of yourself as less than. When the constant message from God is, I don't make any junk. Jesus demonstrates that by going to a cross for your sin. So when I read these texts like this and I realize, oh, I kind of get what Jesus is doing here. That's why he goes on, he says in verse 23, he says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. See, in this text that said, do not murder, Jesus all of a sudden says, you know what the heart of God is behind that? Because some of you are using words that are tearing down instead of building up. And those words, they are killing people. But you're not equating that with murder. But I'm telling you, you're taking the life out of a person's soul. Rather, what you should be doing, and notice in the text, it says, here, they're all going to church, right? They're offering, they're bringing their gifts, but their hearts aren't right. And he says, when you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember, what is the next phrase there? Say it out loud with me. That what? Your brother has something. Say that again. Right, your brother has something against you. So it's not that you have something against your brother. How often would we say, that's his problem? Jesus just made it your problem. If your brother has something against you and you know it, then you have an obligation to go to that brother and what? Seek reconciliation. How different would today be in your life if you just took that advice and tried to go back and bring reconciliation? Now, I get it. Some people, their hearts are hard. Look at Cain. He wasn't hearing it, and God was the one that spoke to him. But every once in a while, you're going to come across some people, and they're going to be blown away by the fact that you cared enough to go that extra mile and to win them over. So do you understand like now why Jesus would call them murderers? Because what he's saying is, look at Cain. If Cain really loved his brother Abel, he wouldn't have retaliated against him. He would have taken that inward look and his life would have been changed. And so now you and I, it's not such a severe thing now, right? Now God is just saying, listen, I just want you to live as children of the light. And if you're living as children of the light, then it has to be seen in the fact that you're children of love. Failure to understand this truth reveals that we're still bound by the dark principles of this world, that we haven't yet quite experienced the spiritual rebirth that comes when the Spirit of God just begins to forgive you of your sin and empowers you to live this Christian life. Don't let a verse like this just be dismissed. Sometimes we get into this attitude like, well, we want to make a difference in the world. And we're always thinking of that huge thing. Well, how about doing something simple like that? And you could change the world for people in that orbit. I've seen families where it's so broken, and someone then builds this bridge of reconciliation, and it happens, and it just didn't happen for those two people, but it came with all those kids and all those siblings. And now what was broken is back together again. And you're getting hugs and feeling like we're family. And they leave and you still have this smile on your face. If you need any further explanation, John gives it to us in the next couple of verses, and I just want to conclude with this. He starts referring back to Jesus, who is the shepherd of our souls. He goes back to the influence that Jesus has on our life. And I want you to just to meditate on this with me for a moment. He goes on in verse 16, and he says, this is how we know what love is. Just for a moment, how does the world define love? The world defines love as if you love me unconditionally, let me just do whatever I want. And even if you don't come right out against them, by the fact that you don't participate in the deeds of darkness, it becomes like we said earlier, right? It's just like, all of a sudden, hey, you're a killjoy, you don't have any fun, you're so narrow-minded. And then you get slammed with all of these, kind of slurs, which is never your intention. God asked me to love everybody. And every once in a while, I have to remind myself that's what God wants from me, because in my human nature, I don't want to turn the other cheek. I want to turn their cheek. I'm just being honest. And then I get the Spirit of God in the back of my head saying, is that how I treated you? I'm like, dang, man, like, why did I ask you to come into my life in the first place? So he's about to tell you what love looks like. Are you open to hear it? Because he says, Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And so you ought to be willing to lay down your life for your brothers. In Romans 5, it says that Jesus died for us while we were yet sinners. That's why sometimes if we're not careful, we can let our politics get in such a way that we wind up hating the other side. When we're being called to be the light, just do the right thing. Be the right person. Let God deal with the rest of it. Sometimes you're going to get the short end of that stick. But didn't Jesus tell you that? He says, blessed are you when men insult you, falsely accuse you, and persecute you because of me. He says, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Jesus did that. Not everybody was so, thinking, oh, it's so great that Jesus would become my substitute. No, they were the ones that were conspiring to bring him to that cross. But it didn't change his mission. It didn't change his focus. That's what love is. Love is sacrificial. Love is redemptive. Love is open-hearted towards others. Let me tell you what love is not. Look at verse 18. He goes on here and he says, verse 17, it says, if anyone has material possessions, sees his brother in need, and has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Again, like, we want to talk about all this stuff, but this is where it hits the road. And then that is inconvenient. But you notice what John is doing. He's saying, listen, if God is light, he's calling you and me then to walk in this light. And if God is love, then we have to be demonstrating this love. There is no other option. Because he already told you, if you say that you walk in the light, but your life is demonstrating darkness, you do not know him. So if we're making room in our theology for, well, I'm more of this and that, that's not the Bible's view. They have to be joined together. And when we fail, what does he say? If you confess your sins, he's faithful and just to forgive you, to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. In other words, let's start again. Let's go at it one more time. And if you're anything like me, you're going to hit your head against that wall 50 million times before finally one day you turn around and go, oh, I guess I should duck. How about verse 18? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. So now everything that he's just been saying, that this is the message that was from the beginning, is so that we recognize that love is not just saying the right things. Love is doing the right things. Verse 19 and 20, he says, this then is how we know that we belong to the truth. By making sure that my love is seen in actions and in truth. Why is truth included in that? You know why truth is included in that phrase? Because it's not just about you doing good things, it's about doing the good things that God is asking us to do. Otherwise, we're going to love people who just think like I do, who believe what I believe, and it becomes a much more segregated kind of community. No, God wants his people to go out into the world and love everybody. Just don't lose the light. Just don't lose your saltiness. He goes, This then is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence whenever our hearts condemn us. For God is greater than our hearts and he knows everything. So this love that's seen in action and in truth, it's informed by the truth of Jesus. And as a result, we have peace with God. There's no more shame. There's no more condemnation. 21 and 22, dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God. We receive from him anything we ask because what? We obey his commands and do what pleases him. That's this right living. You live that way, it says you have God's full attention. Abel had God's full attention. Cain also had God's full attention. He just didn't want to listen to that correction. So last verses here, he says, this is the command, to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us. It means that you're grasping the main thing. That whatever your faith is telling you, if it doesn't result in you loving one another deeply from the heart, then your faith is anemic. And I get it. This is something that we grow into. It's like when you're raising your kids, they're not so keen to share, right? Especially when they're really small, everything is me and mine. And you're like, no, you got to share. And every once in a while, you see those little moments when they could easily have taken all those cookies and stuffed them in their pocket, but they look at their brother and they give them a cookie. It's not very attractive when you're 50 years old and you're still trying to do the same thing. But here is what this command is all about. Those who obey his commands, they live like him. And he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit that he gave us. I want to live out this Christian life. Then it means that I do what pleases him, and in doing what pleases him, it's going to place me in a position to love and show that love indiscriminately. It's God's business to judge the world. My job is just to be the light of the world, to let my light so shine that people see my good work and glorify my Father in heaven. That I don't lose this saltiness of a word that is meant to preserve righteousness and love. So at the end, this is, I hope, what you leave with. That we're called to love one another with actions informed by the truth in Jesus. That's all he's asking you and me to do, which is quite a lot because it goes against sometimes our own desire. But isn't what the Christian life is all about? It's about conforming myself more and more into his image rather than making God up in my image. Love one another with actions informed by the truth that's in Jesus. That's an adventure worth living. That's when you feel the power of God in your life. And every once in a while, there are examples all around. Like when Derek comes up and gives me a hug. Or little wild Errol. I'm not going to forget that little kid. There's a lot of wild people around us. We ought to be wild at heart. Let's show them the love of Jesus.